director here, and I'm really looking forward to Rafael's talk today. But before we get started, I want to remind you of a few announcements. Next week, Wednesday, at 2:20, there's going to be an artist talk in Bedford Hall with Lois Bielefeld. And then following that artist talk from 4 to 6 p.m. in the Mathis Gallery, there'll be a reception for Lois's work as well as Rafael's work. And that'll be in the Mathis Gallery, which is right around the corner. And hopefully you've been able to view that exhibition, I Am Here and You Are Where You Are, which I think of as Rafael's masterfully executed oil paintings that reflect on American tradition and rural identity. And Rafael is a Wisconsin-based artist. He's an arts writer for the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, Newcity Art Chicago, the Isthmus magazine, and Urban Milwaukee. In 2022, Governor Tony Evers appointed Rafael to the Wisconsin Arts Board, the state agency that's responsible for the support and development of arts through Wisconsin. He also serves as the executive board of the Museum of Wisconsin Art. Salas is a professor of art and chair of the Department of Art and Art History at Ripon College, and he's represented by the Portrait Society Gallery in Milwaukee as well. So please welcome Rafael Francisco Salas.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming. I am really honored to be here, and I'm so excited by how the show looks, so I wanted to send a very earnest thank you to Colin Mathis for mounting the show and for inviting me in for this talk as well. I think it looks just great, and I'm so excited to be showing with Lois Bielefeld as well. She's like so rock and roll. She's like the best. So it's a great sort of pairing, I think, and also really interested in how this show was brought together in conjunction with the Laramie Project, which I think is a real sort of compelling way to sort of show our work together. So I'm really happy to be here for that event as well. One more thank you to Professor Anjali Breck for the opportunity to work with her students just a few minutes ago. It was a really great experience. And to Tom Behrens as well. I'll be joining his class right after this, so it's going to be an action-packed afternoon. I do want to say, as we begin the lecture today, that I had the, I'll call it an opportunity or challenge, to totally redo my lecture, because I was invited here a couple of years ago to talk during Hispanic Heritage Month, which was great, but I didn't want to redo the lecture again, so I had to throw everything up in the air. So hopefully, if you were here last time, it's new and exciting. And I'm old enough at this point that we can't start at the beginning, or we won't finish. So we're going to start not too long ago. I thought this painting was a great way to begin today because, to me, it really encapsulates a lot of my thought process and a lot of what's kind of going on in the work as well. So my family comes from, on my father's side, what is called the Tejano diaspora, which is, in layman's terms, seasonal workers that came from southern Texas and ultimately migrated and stayed in Wisconsin. So that's sort of my background on my father's side. My mom's side is an Anglo family from Milwaukee, right? So those two cultures sort of came together in my household. And when I moved back to Wisconsin from New York City a long time ago at this point, I realized that that had become kind of an inspiration for me, that family background, but also the fact that I have been sort of placed back into rural America. I teach at a small college in a very small town. And so the farm fields and the rural areas of Wisconsin are my background, but also my current inspiration as well. So that's what we're seeing here. I'm discussing in this painting the legacy of the farm worker family that I come from, and the agrarian traditions and agrarian landscapes that I'm familiar with. But there's more going on here too. You'll notice that it's winter. The farm workers are in the field, but there's nothing to do in the farm fields in the winter. These figures aren't carrying any tools. They're encapsulating the gestures of farm work, but they're not doing anything. And so what that tells me, or what I guess I'm trying to communicate, is that a painting like this is in the realm of art. We are in the realms of the imagination and the unconscious, and that's the sort of sweet spot for me. I kind of try to connect with the world and traditions and history and the actual, but of course I'm always working in the realms of the imaginary as well, if that makes sense. So from there, this painting was from 2018. We'll jump around a little bit. Again, this will be a somewhat non-linear or quasi-linear lecture. From that painting and from that experience, I've begun to connect with, I mentioned some of the main themes of my work, agrarian traditions, and my farm history past. But in addition, what I've also started to glean in my work was a theme around country music, because of course, country music is the way we describe what rural America means to us, or it's one of the ways we do that, right? Country music is often trying to encapsulate the mythology of rural America, what is romantic about it, what's beautiful, what's tragic, and all of that sort of gets wound up in country music, whether you listen to it or not. I listen to some strands of it, not all of it, but one of the artworks that really kind of encapsulated that to me was this. I was watching a video of Dolly Parton sing her epic song from the 1970s, Jolene, which is about spurned love, right? And this poor woman whose man is cheating on her with Jolene. So here's Dolly Parton actually on stage, Porter Wagner's stage, singing Jolene in her pantsuit. But I found this assemblage piece of this discarded chair at a garage sale, and I imagined it as sort of having a person in it, sort of watching Dolly Parton on TV. The canvas is actually the same dimension as a television, and so the viewer can sort of become that person sitting in the chair, drinking Coors Banquet all night, watching country music. And it gives us maybe a flavor for what it feels like to have lost love, or be nostalgic for a lost love in this empty chair watching television all night long, right? So there's this sort of participatory back and forth, but of course an encapsulation of what it feels like to listen to country music, what it looks like to listen to country music, all in the same package. So here in this detail of the artwork, this is the canvas itself, of course. You even see the stream buffer line of the red on the bottom for that YouTube video. You see some of the pixelation of the screen, because maybe somebody, who knows, puts a gob of peanut butter on a DVD or something. We know what that looks like, right? So I'm trying to put all those ideas together, and of course the decorative elements of the chair become part of the TV. It becomes all part of the same thing, right? So this is kind of the world making I'm trying to create, and some of the themes within it that have become important to me over the years. So that sort of enters into some of the work we're going to see today. We see here these musicians, again, in this sort of imagined Wisconsin winter, surrounded by a snowstorm, but then those abstractions remain to sort of give us a sense of maybe a distilled experience. I'll talk about that in a little bit when we get to other work. I did, in terms of process, I wanted to bring a few more details about how I make work into this lecture too. You know, I hired a model to sit for these poses. I had them, you know, kind of playing a guitar and pretending to play an accordion, have them dress up in a suit. But you'll notice that I don't give them faces that are recognizable. They're kind of abstracted or pushed into the background. And that's intentional too. The human figure, when you can kind of distill it to its essence or kind of break it down into another category, can be anybody, right? It can be an archetype. It could be you or me or anybody else. And to me, that's kind of compelling. It allows the viewer to perhaps enter into the experience. But if I'm being maybe a little more honest too, I just had this talk with another student in the previous session here today. As a mixed race person, sometimes it's hard for me to know which side I land on, right? Like am I talking to the Mexican-American identity or sort of the white identity of who I am. Like, of course, none of those are the complete identity either. So I think there's a lot of confusion there for people who are kind of in that category. And so this kind of nebulous figure, I think, is maybe the sweet spot for me, because that's kind of where I land. And it could be that that's how I interpret this work later on. Sometimes as artists, we sort of have to come back to the content of the work and kind of read it ourselves as if we're the viewer. But you know, it's sort of what I've landed on as to what these figures might be, you know, maybe self-portraits at some level. This next work was maybe a grand encapsulation of some of these themes. It's a big painting, 84 inches, which is what, 8 feet? What, I don't know, it's big, wide. And I remember I was at a funeral, my uncle's funeral, my Uncle Manuel. This was in Milwaukee. It was March, kind of a dismal, cold, rainy afternoon. And I was kind of startled and really interested once we made our way to the funeral, to the cemetery. It was bleak outside, and here was this, my entire, of my father's family were there. And, you know, there was all these Mexican folks in the middle of winter in Wisconsin, and it just seemed sort of ironic or disjunctive. But my Uncle Manuel was a very vain man. He had planned his funeral like well before he died, so it was going to go just the way he wanted. He hired a mariachi band, which was like amazing. You know, so here was this dark, sort of kind of tragic, sad family event, but these like rousing musicians were playing these songs, and it was kind of rainy outside. And I was just like, this is so beautiful and so sad and so strange, that I kind of put those ideas into this painting. I mean, it's not an actual cemetery, but there is a hole in the ground. This band is playing, surrounding it. So I wanted to give it this sort of like kind of huge scope of feeling within it. And I didn't want to give it the sort of specificity of that experience, but I think a lot of what happened that day ended up in this painting. And I found it to be a real sort of exciting experience to paint it. It took months and lots of layering to sort of put it together. But we can see a lot of the kind of abstracted figures in here, of course, the hole in the ground. And in the geometric center of this is a female musician. And she'll come back again in this work. But if you made like a diagonal X right through the middle, we end up right in the middle of her trumpet. So we'll see her again at some point. Everybody doing okay? Okay, good. If you have questions, it's a smaller group. I know we have the mic and everything, but like, you know, there's not tons of people here, so just ask, okay? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Not that particular painting. I can bring it to mind now that you mentioned it, right? Gustave Courbet's work. But my graduate program was at the New York Academy of Art. All we do is study the old masters, right? So a lot of the color, the geometry, the figuration lends itself to those old master traditions. So that doesn't surprise me that there are references to works that you might be familiar with there. Yeah, yeah. Right. Right, as his sort of early modernist work, and you'll see at least one of his contemporaries coming up, I think. So I think you'll be that'll sort of connect to what you saw, I think, as well. So, so I think that's actually a really good reflection of my work. If you're seeing maybe some old masters in it, that's great, because that's kind of where I'm coming from. Yes. So this work it's called. I can't read it. Oh, I don't wait up for days for your voice to answer to me no more, which is a song lyric. And I also used another old master, not quite as old. In this one, George Stubbs is one of the most famous painters of equine subject matter. So rather than going to my mom's farm to photograph her horse, I just took his painting and redid it for my own purposes, because I'm an artist, so I can just take what I need. And it looks like it's sort of based on a historical painting, because of course it is, but I used the landscape from my mother's farm and some of the other kind of abstraction that I mentioned earlier to kind of make that painting into my own. It's meant to echo a black and white photograph or another sort of historical artwork, but as a painter, I can't let myself just sort of use black and white, so I mixed my own blacks and my own whites, so there are moments of warm color and cool color sort of floating back and forth, which makes the painting much more dynamic, I think. And then a lot of my work will also be coated with layers of varnish that are meant to give it a sort of antiquated or otherwise a sort of nostalgic feel, so that they feel a bit older than they are, or at least there's a tension between new and old between it. So that's some of those kind of cruddy, stained moments on there are actually kind of an antiquing sort of feel to them. And then, of course, you'll notice at the bottom is that strange sort of pink abstraction. And that relates back to that painting of Jolene at 1 a.m., right? It is also a distillation of colors in this painting. So the painting looks black and white, but I mentioned that I mixed them. So those reds are actually mixed into and around that horse in the background, right? It looks blue or black and white, but it's a mixture of warms and cools throughout. So I just sort of pulled some of those colors to the bottom of the painting. And then I took those and used some of that abstraction completely in these works from 2018. So these are, in fact, abstractions of album covers, Dolly Parton album covers. I'm not going to tell you which ones. You have to look it up. Well, actually, one of them says it, so I'm giving it away. Forgotten Country, which was the name of my penultimate solo show at Portrait Society Gallery. So yeah, I just threw those into Photoshop and sort of blew them up until they became pixelated and kind of reproduced them, but added some of those layers of patination or varnish over the top as well. And so why did I do that? Well, you know, I'm thinking about a lot of things when this comes up. So what I see that abstraction as is a kind of distillation of experience, right? If you pull things down to their basic color, their most sort of elemental nature. When I look at paintings that use this, sometimes they give me a feeling of you know, like a memory that you can almost recall. You know, like when you walk through a room and you get like maybe a smell and it takes you back to like a former lover, or like you know, your mom's house or cookies or something. It gives you this feeling of a past that is romantic and beautiful, but you can't quite get there, right? Like a dream right before you wake up or something. So to me, they're meant to sort of pair with the realist paintings to give you that, to sort of take you out of the known world and put you into a world that's like it, but not quite the same. And I find that idea very beautiful. So these were, as I mentioned, sort of album covers that connect to these themes of using country music as a description of ourselves, but putting us in a new place. And of course, the canvases themselves are in fact 12 by 12 inches, which is the size of an album cover, right? So it all comes together, right? So I use those on occasion, and if you've been through the show today, you can see that I've isolated some of those abstractions for this show too. A little bit more about process. I mentioned the connections to art history, as our guest mentioned. So I will use gestures, I'll use moves by painters that I admire. Sometimes in that George Stubbs piece, I might just take something out and put it back somewhere else. In this case, I was aware of The Dead Toreador by Edouard Manet. It's a great painting. And I used the gesture of it, not exactly, but similarly, in this work called Man Lying in a Field. And I wanted this figure, I bent the leg and sort of put the hat on his chest to sort of make it a little bit more ambiguous as to whether this figure is sleeping or resting or who knows what, right? And it begs that sort of ambiguity, and I kind of wanted that for this work. It's a quiet piece, and it sort of offers this question of what is happening here, and that mystery to me is compelling. Where am I at here? I just got lost completely. Oh yeah, I got it. Oops. So the landscape itself, of course, is a component of all of these themes I mentioned. And of course, it connects to why I think I was invited to this show and to exhibit artwork in parallel with the Laramie Project. The rural landscape is full of metaphor, and meaning, right? We can look at the landscape and give it the sort of symbolism and meaning that we want, right? It's what the Hudson Bay River painters did. It's what Ansel Adams did in his photographs, right? We use the landscape to give ourselves a story, a meaning, a mythology. And that's true of rural America and true of my paintings. So the landscape can sort of tell us what is beautiful, you know, what is tragic. And I think my artwork sort of does all of that kind of at the same time, or at least that's what I want. So I call this painting Rainbow, but of course it's not a rainbow, it's a tractor tire, right? So I'm talking about landscape, I'm talking about things I actually see, right? You can go through driveways on county roads in Wisconsin and see, you know, someone who has sunk a tractor tire or put like a garden within a tractor tire. And I find that to be really beautiful, like sculpture, right? But also it can describe other things. And in this case, you know, can talk about the land and the sort of aspirational beauty of what a rainbow is, and then sort of reflect on the fact that it's sort of cruddy and man-made at the same time. So there's lots of sort of binary experiences there, which I find really satisfying. So I use this as sort of the anchor for an exhibit I had in Milwaukee at the MOA DTN gallery a couple years ago that was called In Flowered Fields, that of course connected to the landscape and the history of how people have used it in art. And this was a great experience and a great experiment for me. I was invited to not only show my artwork, but to show it in conjunction with artwork from the Museum of Wisconsin Art's collection. And it was awesome. So I got to go through their back rooms and sort of pull out artwork that I thought complemented my work or talked about what I was trying to talk about in different ways. And it was just a great sort of interrogation of landscape and a great way to curate a show that used my work as well as the work of artists who I really admire. So this show discussed, I mentioned a kind of interrogation of landscape. It took on, in my view, what the landscape means to us now, which includes, in the United States, the original sin of colonization, and how we define the landscape today in terms of migration and people and the environment, right? We use the landscape to tell the story of ourselves, and being able to sort of use all these artists together was really kind of a profound experience. It was a really cool show. And I got to do like all the bells and whistles. They let me like paint the walls, and they let me bring in the tractor tire that I cut with a Sawzall at my mom's farm. And even more so, all of the stuff around it is actually wool from my mom's farm. My mom has a sheep farm about 45 minutes from where I live. So I pulled in all this raw wool and put it in there, and it smelled like the farm, which was really great. So you kind of walked into the gallery, and it was kind of smelly. And the curator who was working at the gallery was like, I'm not sure this is a good idea, but I was like, it's going to be great. It's going to be just great. And it worked out. I thought it was really beautiful and kind of weird. I'm not a great sculptor, but I think it was a really interesting experiment. Yeah, so that was that show. This is the next slide. So this is another detail from that exhibit. So you can see a couple of the artists there and how I kind of pulled together ideas. So Charles Sheeler on the right did that painting of the expulsion from Eden, right? So that kind of connected to what I was talking about in terms of colonization and migration, and how, you know, the narratives of how we built America might be reinterpreted depending on how we read it today. Of course, that figure at the top was a dead soldier from the Civil War, which was another way that we kind of interrogated and explained the landscape to ourselves over the years, and combined it with that painting I showed you earlier, right? So you can kind of see how I was pairing and utilizing these work of other artists to sort of pull this together. I admit it was kind of dark. You know, sometimes my paintings go there. Some people might say they often go there. But this was also another painting in that show. So this figure, this kind of ghostly figure sort of walking past other people's interpretations of Animalia or the landscape. Those are all George Stubbs as well. Those I just like ripped off. Those are just copies that I painted in the work. And the wood paneling is just, you know, my childhood. I grew up in the 70s, and that was like, you know, 360-degree view of like what you saw all the time. Yeah, of course. Well, Bam. Let's talk about horses. Great question. So I mentioned that I grew up on a farm, and the horse, I think, can mean lots of things, right? And I had a pony. I'm not like a horseman. I had a pony. She ate pickles. But I took her to the county fair, and I was in 4-H, and I had animals. So it was a part of that tradition. But my mother also at the time trained horses, so I was kind of surrounded by them all the time, and they were big and beautiful and mythic. And I think they tell us a lot about ourselves because of how we kind of interact with them. But to me, in my artwork, they're placeholders for bigger ideas. So in this case, this painting is called Phantom. And to me, the horse here becomes, again, sort of mythic, ambiguously talking about eternal struggles. We can see in this painting Cain and Abel. We can see maybe the suffering of Job. Maybe we can see the judgment of a deity or God himself sort of like falling down upon this poor figure with this small stick in his hand trying to ward it off. So the horse can be so many things, but I think all of those things all at the same time. Did that answer your question? I guess I answered your question with mystery, but sometimes artists have to do that, right? I will say, though, this painting is also taken from another reference. It's a little photograph I saw. I picked up a magazine about country music. Not country music, I'm sorry. Cowboy movies from the 1950s. It was all in black and white. And this was a movie called The Phantom Stallion or something. I've never seen the movie. I just took the image from it because I thought it was perfect. But to me, it really symbolized all these different ideas of what happens upon a landscape. Struggle and judgment and, all of those perhaps biblically elevated topics, right? And then I mixed it with some of the abstraction I mentioned and kind of pulled it all together. So to me, it makes a lot of sense, but, like, what do I know? We were talking about old masters. If you ever go to Madison, there's a Corot painting of a figure with a lyre, or what do you call it? I think that's it, right? Standing, and they're surrounded by this landscape, and Corot always made these great kind of encapsulations of trees that were almost abstractions that kind of framed the figures, and that's kind of what I did here. So I'm always kind of gleaning from other sources for my paintings. Yeah, let's have it. Yeah, well, so I think I referenced it earlier, and I have a couple more notes on it coming up. But again, sort of a distillation of the entirety of the painting can be put into an abstraction. I'm a huge admirer of the painter Sean Scully, who works in geometric abstraction, but he always said in his work that they are reflections of A, landscape, and B, sort of the deep psychology and mood and mythology that can happen in more narrative or more direct paintings. And I want to be able to do it all. I want to be able to have that and that. So I put them all together, and then I have that all at once. But I think they can be read in different ways too. A friend of mine saw this painting and saw the abstraction as the sort of digital censoring of someone who's been sort of taken out of an image that we see. For lack of a better word, they thought it might have been like a dick pic or something, which, like, it wasn't quite what I was going for, but, I guess we could go there, right? But I think, you have to be able to, if you're going to paint a geometric abstraction, you have to allow the audience to find their own path there. You can put a complete stricture on that, but, like, you can't assume that that's where the audience is going to take that. And I have to be okay with that, Yeah, for sure. My palette has over the years kind of shrunk to like a very small palette. I have 7 or 8 colors tops, and that gets used kind of for everything these days. So it's, yeah, everything's kind of pulled from that very kind of minute palette at this point. Next, I have, and I didn't want to put too many works from the show in here, but I did want to talk about this triptych a little bit because it's kind of an anchor for the show, if you've seen it, and hopefully you'll come check it out. So the title is "I Am Here and You Are Where You Are," and it comes somewhat from my childhood, somewhat from memory, and other places as well. Again, it sort of gives me a lot of the grand scope of what history painting and grand paintings can do. What I see are sort of journeys from where we are to where someone else is, right, which is in the title, or moving from the forest primeval to a place of light, right, which can also be sort of metaphorically described as a journey from death to life or life to death, depending on which way we're looking at it. But what it really came from was the woods where I grew up. My girlfriend and I in college went out there and smoked a joint and got totally lost. And we were out there for a long time, like a long time. And eventually we like saw this open field that we walked through and we're like, okay, we're not lost. And we found our way. But I've always sort of laughed about it and talked about it with friends as this sort of just a strange and kind of surreal afternoon. Like we didn't know what was going on. It was kind of scary, but like if you ever go to those woods, they're like, seriously, like so small. We couldn't have gotten lost if we tried. But it kind of gives you everything you need. And I think this is what artists can glean from the world, is that like the smallest details can have like great impact and great importance. And the dumbest moments of your life can have a grand sort of scale as an artwork. And, you know, I think if anything, that's a great lesson, is that like we can find inspiration from the smallest of things. And that happens to me all the time. I live in a very tiny town, and sometimes I feel like I can never get inspired by it, and then things will just come to me. So I read this painting for myself as having lots of transitions and journeys from one place to another, as I mentioned. And the more I think about where I live and sort of where America is now, the sort of polarization we have as people, I kind of see the before and after, or the transition from one place to another, as kind of demonstrating that tension. And I'll have more to say about that in a little bit, so I'm just going to let that lie and move on to the next piece, which isolates a few more of those abstractions. So I've talked about those a bit, but I just want to kind of show that I'm kind of using them still. I'm still trying to find some inspiration from them. And as you can see in the show, I'm kind of comparing them. So in the gallery, this triptych is surrounded by these small abstractions, and they're little, about 8 by 8. But what I'm hoping the viewer will be able to do is say, I see this, and I see this, and I see this. Sorry, I was on a roll, and I hit the wrong button. I see this, and I see this, and they can begin to compare. Because, as I mentioned, the palette is similar, and what I hope the mood or the feeling is can be similar too. Does that make sense? Maybe a little. You're like, no, not at all. It's what we can do. It's what I'm trying, right? So from there, again, finding inspiration, finding ways to sort of move forward, bringing experiments in, but still maintaining a lot of the ideas that I use. I created this triptych a couple years ago that's called the County Fair, numbers 1 through 3. And that's the theme that I sort of began using a couple years ago, and it has maintained. I went to a county fair a couple years ago. I used to go as a kid. I mentioned this, we have 4-H and horses and whatnot. And it kind of had everything and reminded me that this sort of coming together kind of bore lots of beauty and tragedy and innocence lost, kind of all in the same place. You know, it's kind of beautiful and cruddy and full of lights and like cow poop all at the same time, right? And so I kind of loved how all of that came together. And so I used these again, sort of archetypal characters to describe the human condition at the fair. So we have a young woman carrying this calf. It looks like the calf may be sick or dying, right? So she becomes almost a Christ figure, the figure in the center with her doppelganger animal, spirit animal. Next to it, she's the beauty queen, but of course, like, she's far more dangerous than that, right? And then another reference to art history on the right, if we know Edouard Millet's The Sower of Seeds, I was kind of referencing that kind of allegorical figure of labor on the right too. So again, sort of bringing in these different influences from art history within this triptych. And of course, the triptych has its own narrative in religious art that was brought to bear in the 20th century through Francis Bacon. If you know his work, he would make triptychs that alluded to religious artwork, but he was talking about the existential crises of the human condition without God, right? So, you know, all of that stuff is all up in here all at the same time. What else do we have here? Sorry, I keep getting excited, then I lose where I'm at. County Fair, yes. Oh yeah, I did want to show a few kind of process images too. I thought you might find these interesting. So the way that I work, I do lots of drawing, and I kind of find my way through those. It's a great way to sort of try stuff on and discard what doesn't work. But I do keep the drawings too. I teach drawing and painting, and I find that my drawings, to me at least, are as satisfying and as deep and as thorough as the artworks themselves, as the paintings themselves. Not always, but so I'm going through these studies and I'm trying to figure out this composition. You know, sometimes the figures are more realized, sometimes they're facing towards each other, the abstractions sort of enter in, and then, you know, I kind of pull all that together into this finished work that I called Summer's End. The county fair happens at the summer's end. The fall transitions from the summer and becomes an end of life or an end of season, right? So what does that mean to me? Lots of things. I mentioned that I went to county fair and I take photos, I sort of walk around. What I was surprised by a couple years ago is in contrast to the county fair that I remember as a kid, maybe it's always been this way and I just remembered the twinkly lights and my horse, but what I was surprised by was how kind of politically polarized the county fair had become. Like even the carnival games, like everything that you won was like a political poster or a political flag or like a political hat. And I was like, wow, it's just like, this is all there, this is it, right? So like everything you get has something to do with how polarized we are as a country. So to me, that became this sort of divide in what the county fair meant to me initially, which was this sort of galvanizing and coming together and this celebration of rural traditions. And what I was seeing, which was sort of a direct kind of push to sort of separate. And I found that tension to be weird, but also like really compelling and inspiring to me at the same time. So, you know, I was taking a lot of photos and some of those enter into the artwork and some don't. Some become drawings and then some become paintings. So, you know, here's a drawing of, a photo of chickens, which is not I'm a terrible photographer. But it comes and becomes this sort of just pile of straw, which, oh, question, yeah, please. Yeah, I mean, for me, there's no way not to read it, at least from one angle, as sort of digitized imagery, right? Or sort of the mediated way that we experience life through screens. That's one of the entry points for the painting. It has to be, right? But then in addition, the fact that it's painted with the colors that I use for more realistic landscapes sort of puts that in sort of contrast too. So I think there's a lot of entry points for the work, and to me, I'm really happy about that. The sort of mystery that we were talking about earlier is a direct component of why I make the work and why I make them perhaps more ambiguous than literal. If an artist makes a work that is like totally clear, there's not a whole lot to talk about, right? It's like, oh, I get it, and then you move on, right? I would call that maybe a bit too didactic. So mystery is good, in my view, because it allows entry points from lots of different gazes, if that makes sense. So the answer is very often yes, if that makes sense. And I think I just have, oh no, I have a few more, but I will move through these because we're coming to the end here. County Fair, abstraction, the stuff we're talking about, right? And I'm actually working on a canvas of this right now. I don't want to bring it because it doesn't look great yet, but I'll let you know. But this is a watercolor study, just kind of little, where I'm kind of testing it out, right? And just a couple more here. A concession stand that can sort of turn into a almost kind of mythic evocation of itself when it's isolated on the landscape. I was going to talk about Cormac McCarthy, but I'm not going to talk about Cormac McCarthy. Anybody read Cormac McCarthy? So good, like so good. American landscape, right? Yeah, it's other stuff. Another discussion. I call this trellis and fading flowers. Again, it relates to some of the abstraction. It relates to Summer's End. I love how it's sort of close to the abstraction, but not there. And it's so familiar. This is like anybody's mom's backyard in Wisconsin with the fading black-eyed Susans. And then prize cake, which we can talk about sacrifice, we can talk about religion, we can talk about redemption, the woodcutter, you know, all of these things, right? It can mean any and all of these things all at the same time. Yeah. Summer's End, Girl in the Lights. So the county fair thing is where I'm at now. These are the paintings that I'm continuing to work on. So we'll see where they go. But I'm kind of like in the thick of really being inspired by what happens at the county fair and what that can tell me, and hopefully what it can communicate. So I told you the trumpet player would be back again, and here she is in all her glory. But here she is playing at the county fair. Yeah. And then the last slide here are just a few of ideas that I've used, that I might use, or that I've decided not to use. So there's probably the largest canvas in the show is a landscape with a ring of flags around it. And the early version of that is what I put into this slide on the left. So just to kind of show you, you know, how these drawings emerge, sometimes where they go, sometimes where they don't go. So yeah. Mm. What did I say before? Yes. It's always yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's the kind of archetypal character of that figure, and I intentionally made the skin tone of that figure ambiguous, right? Are they Latino? Are they black? Are they white? It's you don't know, and again, that makes it feel like me. So at some level, any figure that a painter inserts into a painting is going to be a self-portrait, even if, you know, the gender doesn't match. But the fact that I originally painted that figure at a funeral, I think could connect to, you know, a sense of grief, a sense of longing, a sense of loss. So the answer is always yes, right? Exactly. These are great questions, by the way. I really appreciate how kind of perceptive the audience is about these paintings, because, you know, this is a place where I feel like as a teacher, you know, I can try to kind of communicate what I'm doing and to try to be as vulnerable in that place, because I think often people get, you know, intimidated by artwork like a geometric abstraction. Like how the heck am I supposed to enter that? How am I supposed to feel when I see that? And having that discussion here, I think, is great. I mean, I think it's a great way for an artist to sort of feel that there's a way to connect with the audience. So are there other questions about the work? This is kind of my spiel, so I'm happy to take more. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would like to say that I don't rely on the figure, but I think you're right. I guess I hadn't thought about it in that way, but like, so a painting like this, you know, there's no figure, but you almost can't help but try to interpret it through somebody's gaze as a figure, right? I mean, I see, now when you say that, I'm like, well, yeah, I guess there is sort of a figure there. Or, you know, who made the cake, or who was the lumberjack, the woodcutter there, right? So, yeah, I think you're probably right. I hadn't thought about it before. I think the figure probably is endemic in the works kind of all the time. So even that drawing on the left, the large image there, ultimately that painting didn't have a figure, but at some point it did, right? So yeah, I think that's probably true. Never thought about it before. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know that I'm thinking about the prizes, but I think that's probably a perceptive reflection on it. I guess the sort of irony I see in it that's interesting me right now is like how decorative and beautiful it can be, and also how sort of cruddy and trashy it can be, and sort of how it's sort of doing all of that at the same time. Like it's celebrating agrarian traditions, but it's also like doing other stuff. So, you know, I feel like there's lots of sort of ways to sort of enter that conversation. But yeah, I wasn't thinking about the prizes in particular, and I would go further even to say I've taken them out. I don't know if I have. Yeah, so in the carnival game, in the painting that I'm working on, I don't have the specific, you know, text or details of it, because I don't want it to. I don't want the painting to have to be that didactic. I want it to be open-ended for the viewer, and so being that literal is too much for me, right? Are there other thoughts? I think we're sort of getting to the end here, but sure, I could take one more. Yeah, and right. So yeah, that's a good example. I mhm, mhm. Yeah. So a couple of the artists who I really admire and who I think use the figure, but also kind of obscure the figure would be, and there's lots of them, but maybe the most obvious would be like Alberto Giacometti or Francis Bacon, right? So they make either archetypal faces, faces that could be anybody, which I'm interested in that kind of universality, or you know, in Francis Bacon's sense, they're just like pulled or contorted to the point where they become an abstraction that alludes to the face but isn't the face. And that ambiguity, I think, is really powerful. So it's something that I try to echo at times. Yes. Does that answer your question? Uh, because I think it gives them a universality or an archetypal quality where anyone can sort of enter into it. It could be you, it could be me, it could be anybody. Again, and I like how kind of open-ended that is. A specific portrait sort of demands a more literal interpretation, and that I don't want that. Again, sort of mystery is kind of the sweet spot for me, at least at some point, right? Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're running up against an hour here, and I have to get to Professor Tom Barron's class, so maybe one more question if we have one? Okay, last one. Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned a little bit earlier that they are kind of, yeah, they're interruptions, right, from how we're experiencing the realistic work. And I guess I kind of want that in a way. So one way that it could be interpreted is, as we kind of mentioned earlier, is we kind of live our world through a kind of mediated experience, right? So are we looking at a painting? Are we looking at a screen? Am I looking at you, or am I looking at my phone? It kind of all becomes the same thing at some point. And so that kind of like overarching abstraction, I think, can be a part of it. And then I also am interested in this idea of distilling the sort of essence of the paintings into its sort of most basic component parts and seeing what it can do. You know, whether I'm successful or not, I guess, you know, I have to sort of let that fall to you to tell me. But that's, you know, some of the ways I'm trying to use that abstraction, if that makes sense. Cool. Thank you all. This is like the most fun for me. I could have been like back in my office doing like assessment reports. So like this is like the best. All right. Thank you very much. And oh, and one more plug. There's going to be a reception for the show next Wednesday from 4 to 6. So if you're free, come see the paintings. I'll be happy to talk more about them and would love to share them with you if you're free. All right. Thanks a lot.